We go. Good evening. We're in the midst of a study of the booklets. They're evangelistic booklets, but they're kind of designed for a situation where you may have somebody who is not a believer. They may not believe in God, or they may be unsure. They may be unsure about the inspiration of the Bible. They may be unsure about Jesus. Is Jesus God? Is He the only way? And so these studies are designed to deal with that. I have a few extra booklets. If you want a copy of these, I've got sets of 3. Who needs? Oh, well, we've got several. Bob already told me he would help me out. Thank you, Bob. And they'll be, everything we look at will be on the screen, but I know some folks may want to have a hard copy, and hopefully you can use these. But this is, it's kind of a twofold purpose. It's some evangelism training for those who are already Christians to go out and to work with others, because again, you may have a situation where you can't just say, well, let's sit down and have a Bible study, because they may not believe the Bible, may not believe in God, may not believe that the words of Jesus are authoritative, because they don't understand exactly who Jesus is. And you see this more and more in the world in which we find ourselves, and so it's good for us to be prepared. So it's kind of a training in that sense for us, those of us who are Christians and interested in evangelism, which hopefully all of us as Christians are, but also it's to strengthen our faith. You may be already prepared to answer some of these questions, but it just helps us to study these things and to be convicted and understand. And in that vein, I ran across an article. This was just, I think, right at a couple weeks, tomorrow will be 2 weeks ago. I was going to look at this verse to make sure I get it right, but the article reminded me of a statement that Jesus makes in Luke 16:8. Thank you. Luke 16:8, Jesus makes the statement. He's given this parable about the unjust steward, but in that context he says the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. And that statement comes to mind because this article is written by someone who is not a member of the body of Christ, and yet in some ways I think, well, there's no doubt in some of these he's got it down better than some folks who are Christians, sometimes even folks who have been Christians for a long time. But the article is by a man named Ed Stetzer, and it's called 7 Reasons Evangelism Has Declined in the Church. Again, he's coming at it from a denominational perspective, but some really good points. And I'm not going to read the whole article to you, obviously, but I do want to mention just the reasons he gives, because a couple of these are really pertinent to our study and the reason we're going through this study. Number 1, he says there's been a bit of backlash to past models that seemed reductionistic and mechanistic. And I won't unpack all that because, for one thing, and now this is one where I kind of look at it and I just sort of shake my head and I say, well, people get, and this happens in the Lord's church too, people get so hung up on methods, this method, that method, and sometimes we have meetings about it and we form committees to have meetings about it, and we talk a subject to death sometimes, right? And if you work in a business environment, you have all these meetings, and so often you're thinking to yourself as you leave a meeting, this could have been handled in an email. And people there are all these memes about that. Yet another meeting that could have, yet another 2-hour meeting that could have been handled with a simple email. But sometimes we talk something to death when we just need to get out and do it. That's often the case with evangelism. He does make a statement under that point. You're more likely now to find Christians make jokes about the way they used to do evangelism than actually do evangelism. And that often is the case. He does mention, instead of starting with our questions, He kind of critiques somehow the way sometimes people would traditionally start with these certain questions. But he says instead of starting with our questions, we should start where people are and walk them to the gospel. And there is some truth in that. We can analyze and stress over so many little details to the point that we just end up doing nothing. And so, many times we just start where people are. And you find in the gospel accounts that's what Jesus so often did. Number 2 reason he gives, many believers don't have confidence in the gospel. Oh, how true this one is. He talks about a Lifeway research study found about half the people who regularly attend, and as he calls it, evangelical church, they give a pluralistic or a universalistic answer to questions about the need for people to know Christ. In other words, pluralistic meaning, I follow the Bible and I'm a disciple of Jesus, but what about people in other world religions, and they're good people. They're following the same God. They believe in God, and so I don't know if I should be criticizing that or trying to worry about them. And that's the idea sometimes people have. Jesus, though, states very plainly, right? I am the way, the truth, the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. John 14:6. So that's very true, though. It's amazing how often even members of the body of Christ, they're not convicted. God is. They're not convicted perhaps that the Bible is inspired of God. They're maybe not convicted that Jesus is the way, the truth, the life. And he talks about the need for showing how the Bible applies to all of life, even up to and including careers and so on. Again, very true. Number 3 says, it's getting harder to share the gospel in a context where people are further away from what their parents or grandparents believed. This one and the previous one are 2 big reasons for having this particular study. And what he means by number 3 is you can't just assume people believe things like you. A lot of us grew up in the deep South, and when I was a young person, a teenager, we would often go down to Southeast Georgia, and do mission work there that my home congregation helped to support. And we would go and work with those local brethren. We'd go out and knock doors, and man, I don't know what the percentage was, but it was a huge percentage of the doors you knocked on, they believed in God. You consider yourself to be a Christian person? Oh, yeah. You believe the Bible? Oh, yeah. Okay, well, let's sit down and have a Bible study. And so you could talk to somebody, and the people I went to school with, vast majority of them, They believed in God. They believed in the Bible. They believed Jesus is the Christ. They may have some misunderstanding on things, but we could talk about it from that standpoint. Well, a lot of times people are going out and sometimes they'll start a conversation with somebody and they discover, well, they don't believe in God, and it's kind of like, okay, well, what next? So again, he has a good suggestion. You can't just assume they believe things like you. Do like Paul at Mars Hill. Start where they are and show them Jesus. That's what Paul does there in his sermon on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. Number 4 reason he gives, replacing evangelism with another spiritual emphasis. This can happen, and it does happen sometimes. He talks about people getting hung up on whatever the current thing is. Sometimes it's media, social justice, societal transformation, and things like that. Not to say those things aren't important, but sometimes they get so much emphasis that you have people, and in fact he mentions this, you'll hear folks sometimes say, we still believe in evangelism. He says saying that, though, means you're about a decade from not believing in evangelism. Because, and this is spot on, what we neglect in one generation is often rejected in the next. And that's so true. And that can happen with evangelism. So he makes the good point. Add important issues without subtracting a focus on evangelism. It's not an either-or proposition. Number 5 he gives is our lack of compassion for the lost around us. Mentions Matthew 9:37, where Jesus talks about the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few. But in the previous verse, he says Jesus saw the multitudes and he had what? Compassion. And I've mentioned this before, and maybe you remember it because it's one of those, I can't remember a whole ton of Greek words that I've learned, but I don't think I'll ever forget this one if I live to be 100, because it's just such a funny sounding word. But the word is something like, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, splunk-nidzamai. And it is as he describes it, I think it's a very good paraphrase of the definition, a deep, gut-wrenching affection. And we all have experienced that at some point or another, where you get a knot in your gut, and you can't rest easy until you do something, if there is something, in fact, that you can do. It may even be that you realize, well, there's not really anything I can do, but you're at least going to pray for that person, pray for that situation. Now, many of us have experienced that in the last few months, watching some of what's happened over in the Ukraine. It just gets to you. And, he asks, or makes the observation, one of the reasons people don't share the gospel is they don't share the deep compassion of Jesus. And he asks these two questions. Man, these are penetrating questions. Do we care for people? If not, do we care about the fact that we don't care? Number 6 reason he gives, there's not more evangelism taking place. There's a fear of not having the answers to questions people raise. Again, that ties in with why we're doing this study. Maybe somebody, as you're talking about them, says, well, why is it that you believe Jesus is the only way? Why couldn't somebody reach God just as easily? They believe in the supreme God. Why couldn't they reach him just as easily through fill in the blank with the world religion? We may be kind of like, and I've mentioned in here before about the conversation I had with the fellow that I got to know a little bit up in Chattanooga. And that was kind of how I was when he first mentioned some of these things. I had to do some research. He does make a good point here. It's okay to say, I don't know. Now, don't leave it at that. Say, I don't know, but I will find you the answer. When I worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee, they said, look, nobody has the benefits book memorized. There are going to be times when somebody calls in, they ask a question. Don't just try to give an answer that you think is correct, because that had happened before where somebody gave a wrong, just completely wrong answer. Yes, that's covered. And then the company ends up in a situation where now they have to deal with somebody who says, all your phone calls are recorded. You can pull it up. They said it was covered, and I had a few people that pushed it, and they ended up getting something covered that was not supposed to be covered because somebody gave out wrong information. They said, that has serious consequences for you as an employee. Don't give out wrong information. If you don't know, just say, I don't know. Let me research that, and I will get back to you. Get a callback number. Go talk to a team leader. Go talk to the supervisor. Go talk to whoever you need to talk to. Find the answer, and call them back. And evangelism, when we're talking to people about the Lord, about the Bible, about the church, there may be times you don't know something. Don't be afraid to say, I'm not sure about that. I don't know that I've ever encountered that. In fact, that was my exact response to that gentleman in Chattanooga. I said, look, you know what? I don't know that I've ever heard these things before. He was talking about all these other savior gods, as he used that term. I said, but let me do some research. Bear with me. You've unloaded quite a bit here. It was a long email. And I said, but I'm going to research it, and I'm going to get back to you on that because I want to know for my own faith and conviction. So, sometimes people are afraid that they don't have the answers to the questions that people raise. And then number 7, he says some people think their lives aren't good enough. And that's how sometimes people feel, well, I'm such a work in progress, and so they're not talking to anybody about the Lord because of that. But, he makes the point that God uses broken, messed up people just like us. And one of the things about talking to people about the Lord is that we can be open and share that we are also imperfect. That's one of the things that, I think it's good for Christians to emphasize to people is nobody says, oh, we're perfect. We're imperfect people. We have struggles. We have temptations. And the fact is sometimes we succumb to those temptations. But, as he says it, Jesus saves and he's making us whole. We're a work in progress, in other words. I like what he says here, that authenticity and vulnerability is effective in sharing Christ. People understand that, you know what? I don't go to church, and I'm not a part of Christ's church because I'm perfect. I go to church, and I'm a part of the body of Christ because I'm not perfect. And I realize I need a Savior. And I'm striving every day to grow more and more into His image. And I want to help others to do that as well. But I thought that was of interest, and I wanted to share that with the class because I think that's very, very, many of those are very pertinent to what we're talking about here in this study. I'm going to move quickly through some of these. Again, they're in the booklet if you weren't here the previous weeks, but we're on slide, I think it's like 10 of this, so I'm just going to move. There we go. So we've looked at the cause and effect idea, and we talked about that extensively. And I will just kind of sum up that as we get into design, and design must have a designer, design demands a designer, we sometimes say it. I have a book from Apologetics Press that's out of print. They've kind of updated. Sometimes from time to time they'll update books, and this one is no longer in print because they've updated it under a different title, but it was by it was Kyle Budd, and maybe Bert Thompson might have co-authored it with him. But anyways, the statement is made, atheism is forced to assume that physical life at some remote point in the past was spontaneously generated from inorganic materials, but the evidence is squarely against this notion. There is an evolutionist, in fact, you might even recognize the name because he was, I say was, I'm not sure if he's still alive, I'm thinking he's not, but the name is George Gaylord Simpson. And a quote, this is a quote from a biology textbook referring to spontaneous generation of life. And the text says it, quote, does not occur in any known case, end quote. And yet that's what evolution is forced to say, is that life somehow, some way, at some remote point in the past, for the only time ever, spontaneously generated from inorganic material. And you've heard, no doubt, before the probabilities. They're just astronomical. Chance formation of the simplest life form, probabilities are something like 1 in 1 times 10 to the 340 millionth power. That's a 10 followed by 340 million zeros. To compare that number, by the way, it's said that the universe is said to contain only 10 to the 80 electrons in the entire universe, something along those lines. But 1 in 10 to the 340 million. Dr. Carl Sagan estimated the chance of life evolving on Earth to be something like 1 in 1 times 10 to the 2 trillionth power. That's a 10 followed by 2 trillion zeros. And they note, Kyle, and if I'm right, with co-authoring that with Bert Thompson, they note that it would take 6,000 books of 300 pages each just to write that number. 1 in 1 times 10 to the 2 trillionth power. Yet we're supposed to believe that just freakishly happened one time in history. Professor Edwin Conklin of Princeton University put it this way, the probability, this is a quote, the probability of life originating from accident is comparable to the probability of the unabridged dictionary resulting from an explosion in a printing shop, end quote. That's the kind of probabilities you're looking at. It just doesn't add up. And so cause and effect, every effect must have a cause, but not just a cause, an adequate cause. And to say that life just spontaneously generated from inorganic material at some point in the remote past, well, that is a cause, but folks, that is not an adequate cause. Now, looking at this, some of this design and designer, every design must have a designer, would it not be impossible for a camera to build itself? That's one of those rhetorical questions, right? The answer is obvious. To ask that question is to answer it. No, it is not or yes, it would be impossible for a camera to build itself. Can a camera appear from nothing? Obvious answer there, no. Does the existence of a camera demand that it came from something? Well, yes, it does. We wouldn't look at a camera or any kind of device that we have, and I mean, you could talk about anything from cell phones to tablets to PCs, whatever. We wouldn't look at that and say, well, look at that. That just came to be. Somebody shared with me recently, might have been Corey, and I think it was Chris or Stephanie, one that shared it with me again even more recently. But there's a little clip of Ronald Reagan, and he says something about he doesn't understand the atheistic mindset. And he said, I would like to invite some of those folks over to the White House sometime and have the most delicious meal prepared for them, and then to try to convince them that there was no cook. And that's kind of the similar idea here. Design demands a designer. We wouldn't look at a device and say, well, that must have just happened. How about that? Isn't that something? We want to know. You see something like that, well, I wonder who made that. And then we may be just asking about a manufacturer, but we understand there are people, they're doing these things. It has to come from somewhere. It has to have a designer. Next question here, wouldn't the creation of a camera require something or someone superior and exterior as the creator? Again, an obvious answer. Yes, it would. Does the camera demonstrate complex design? Well, it absolutely does. Going on, wouldn't it be absurd to believe a camera could be created by an explosion in a parts factory? It would absolutely be absurd. No one would believe that. Is the human eye greater than the camera? Well, I think most people understand it is, but it wouldn't take a PhD by any stretch in biology or physiology, anatomy, to understand the human eye. As far as we've come with camera technology, it just doesn't compare. If a camera requires a superior and exterior creator, would the human eye also require a superior and exterior creator? Well, again, the answer there is very obvious. Yes, it absolutely would. Now, here's some summary questions dealing with this idea of design demands a designer. Does a design require a designer? Yes. Yes, it does. Does the universe demonstrate characteristics of design? Yes, it does. Does the human body demonstrate characteristics of design? Yes, it does. Therefore, would it be reasonable to conclude the universe must have a designer? I submit to you that is the most reasonable, logical conclusion. I don't know how we conclude otherwise reasonably, because design demands a designer. You see the quote there from Psalm 139:14, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, when it comes to this idea of design and design demanding a designer, before we get into morality, I do want to mention the people commonly realize that when you have order and design in a system, they imply intelligence, they imply purpose on the part of the originating cause. Somebody, now you may look at something and say, I don't agree, I think that is worthless, but whoever designed it, they had a purpose, right? They had to have some kind of intelligence to have designed it, and they had to have a reason for designing it. The universe around us, even expanding beyond just the earth, even beyond our solar system, of course, shows amazing design and purpose. And so the question is it more reasonable to believe that the design was planned or that it's just simply accidental? And again, I submit to ask that question is to answer it. Is it more reasonable to believe that the design we see all around us was planned and created by a grand designer, or that it was just an accident? We could spend so much time just on this, but mention just a couple of things, talking about design. And imagine these things just happening accidentally. Astronomical laws, the preciseness of the universe's astronomical laws are, the preciseness of them, it is just simply amazing. Because of the preciseness of those laws, we can launch rockets to the moon. And you could pick a spot on the moon, if you had somebody there just to mark an X, land your rocket right here, and they could do it. And you know how they can do that? It's because of the preciseness of astronomical laws. They can do, they figure out equations and how to calculate this and calculate that. It's all well beyond me, beyond my math skills. But they can do that because of the laws of the universe, astronomical laws. I think about the solar system. The Earth is about 93 million miles from the 12 million degree Fahrenheit source of heat. We call it the sun, of course. That distance happens to be just right. We've looked before, and we'll do so toward the end of the Science in the Bible series, Lord willing, next year. But there are other planets, and you see some of those planets that are farther away from the sun, and it's something like a difference of 2%, I think was what I saw one time. If the Earth is just a few percentages farther away from the sun, it's uninhabitable because it's too cold to sustain life. If it's just a little bit closer, it's too hot to sustain life. We have an atmosphere around Earth. Some of the other planets, when you, again, we'll look at that more in depth in that particular lesson, but many of the other planets, you go from daytime temperatures that are in the 4, 5, 6, 700 degrees, and I believe, if I remember correctly, that was Celsius, which would be getting astronomical numbers Fahrenheit, but hundreds of degrees in the daytime, and then when it gets night, when it gets dark, you're talking way, way below freezing. Sometimes going into the negative hundreds below freezing. Why is that? They don't have the atmosphere that the Earth has. Also, you have oceans that serve as insulators and other bodies of water as well, but primarily oceans. So there are so many different things you could talk about just with the solar system. The elliptical orbit around the sun. Even that's not at a constant rate, but it's just right. One scientist, A. Cressy Morrison, says, quote, its rotation on its axis is determined so accurately that a variation of a second in a century would upset astronomical calculations. And yet it doesn't. Did that just happen accidentally? Or was it designed that way? It's the only inhabitable planet in the solar system. Why? One, I believe it was Noby Stone speaking down at Carrollton's Youth Day several years ago, called it the Goldilocks principle. I believe that was where I got that. It wasn't him that mentioned that. And he talked about how, in Goldilocks there was something was either too hot, too cold, and then it was just right. A bed too big, a bed too small, and then a bed just right. The just right, the Goldilocks principle. And Earth is just right for life to exist and thrive. Again, is that accidental? Is it reasonable to believe that that's just an accident? Even just talking about the oceans, there's so much you could talk about it with that. The oceans contain salt. That enables clouds and rains to form in the atmosphere, and yet not develop too strong in alkalinity or acidity. Just by accident. The living human organism. The human body is made up of trillions of cells. In the nucleus of each cell, you have hundreds of thousands of genes that are present. Each gene consists of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And that has a complicated code for mapping out the entire development of an individual. It is said if the instructions of a single human cell were put into English, it would fill a 1,000-volume encyclopedia. That's just nothing short of amazing, folks. But you're telling me that just happened by accident? It's estimated that the total DNA in a human body, and you've no doubt have seen the double helix, that if you could stretch that out, the total DNA in a human body, it's estimated by many scientists that it would span the entire solar system. But here's the question. Here's the big question, talking about the human body, and particularly DNA. Could there logically be a code, DNA, that carries a message originated by no one? You can't answer that logically without a designer, without a creator. And yet evolution, the theory of macroevolution, would have us to believe that to be the case. The human body is a whole galaxy of related systems. They all affirm design. We could spend a lot of time on that, but again, each system is composed of millions of interrelated components. Each system is dependent upon the other for its function. Was it just an accident? A Boeing 747 jet is made up of a collection of, I'm told, something like 4.5 million non-flying parts. But somebody designed a way that when all those parts are put together, and when they're put together according to a designed pattern, they become a flying machine. And you stop and think, that alone is staggering. And I sometimes sit, and maybe if we're driving near Atlanta and get close enough to the airport, and you'll see some planes coming over, and especially if there's one that's pretty low. The other day we were headed toward Atlanta, and had some of the kids with me, and we're look at that plane. I mean, this thing was coming in. I think actually that particular time I guess it had just taken off, but it was still far lower than usual. And sometimes I just sit there and I just can't get over it. You think about the weight of one of those things. I don't know what it weighs, but it's a lot. And you can get that thing up in the air and fly, and it's a composition of all these millions of parts. It's just staggering. And yet, stop and think about that for just a moment, and think about this. The human body is infinitely more complex than a Boeing 747 jet. Again, are we supposed to believe it's just an accident? The human brain. Isaac Asimov, maybe you've heard the name, well-known writer, also an atheist. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he's died several years ago, I believe. But he said this of the human brain, quote, quote, is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter in the universe, end quote. The brain really is a giant calculator or a computer. There's a fellow, Dr. Gerhard Dirks. He, at one time at least, held 50 patents on the IBM computer. Said he acquired most of his inventive ideas from studying the human brain. Again, here's the big question. If it takes a mind to build a computer, who can believe it did not take a mind to build the mind that built the computer? Accidental design it just doesn't suffice, folks. There's no way. But if we didn't have enough evidence from cause and effect, if we didn't have enough evidence to convince us from design all around us, think about the concept of morality. And that's what this next set of questions deals with. If a national law required you to exterminate all blonde-haired people, would that law be moral or immoral? We understand that. That would be immoral. There's nothing moral about that. It's wrong. If the law of the majority required you to exterminate all blonde-haired people, would that law be... that's just the same question, isn't it? I just realized that. No. If the first one says national law. If the law of the majority required you to... I just didn't have the right emphasis there. I had the emphasis on the wrong syllable. If the law of the majority required you to exterminate all blonde-haired people, would that law be moral or immoral? Well, again, it would obviously be immoral. It doesn't matter if it's a national law. It doesn't matter if people get together and they vote and 95% say, let's just get rid of all the blonde-haired people. It doesn't make it moral. If international law required you to exterminate all blonde-haired people, would that law be moral or immoral? Again, to ask that question is to answer it. There's nothing moral about that. Is there a law that would protect all blonde-haired people from the majority national or international law. And again, this is something that when you're dealing with somebody that's struggling with belief in God, you got to deal with morality. Morals arise only in man. I was trying to remember, I read that quote years ago, and it might have been in that same book from Apologetics Press. And I think it was the fellow I mentioned before, George Gaylord Simpson, that made that statement. Morals arise only in man. I had some quotes from that book in my notes, and I don't. Yes, it is. Okay, I did write it down. George Gaylord Simpson said that. Morals arise only in man. Well, you got to deal with that, because what if, and I've asked people this sometimes in a conversation, what if there's a national law that says all of a certain kind of people should be exterminated? And I don't think I've ever had anybody say, "Oh, I think that'd be fine." Okay, what if there's a majority vote? I think we should exterminate all of these people. Oh, no, that wouldn't be okay. What about international law? What if it's an international group of countries that get together and they decide they're going to make this law? No, that's not okay. Well, what is the law that would protect those people from whether it be a majority or a national law or an international law? Would it not be a superseding law from a creator? It's the law of God, right? And that's, of course, answers the question, where does it come from? Bob, you were going to say something.
Yeah, there is such a thing as a monkey trial, the Scopes monkey trial.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never heard of a bunch of monkeys getting together, having a defense and a DA, and go over what happened in their local area about this monkey getting killed by this other monkey. I've never heard that happen. Only the human being.
Bob said he's heard of a monkey trial. We sometimes talk about the Scopes monkey trial, but never heard of a group of monkeys getting together to have a trial and talk about something that had happened in the jungle or something happened among their kind. And I've often used the illustration, sometimes you watch National Geographic or something like that. You see one of these videos where the lions are out and they're stalking the prey, and then off they go, and maybe even more often than not, they're looking for the weak, maybe slightly handicapped or disabled in some way, injured, or perhaps just young and not able to run as fast. Or they may look for particular prey that's gotten separated from the herd or something like that, but they go and they attack, and sometimes you'll watch that and they'll take that thing down and they'll commence to eating, sometimes before that thing is even dead. But you know what I've never seen, never even heard of, one of those situations, is one of those lions stopping and saying, guys, this is not good. I mean, this animal didn't do anything to us. And here we are, we're just killing this thing. They don't do that. They'll say, I feel really bad about that. We should pick on somebody our own size. We should go for the strongest, because that's not really right to pick on those weaker. Animals don't do that. That's just not in their nature. Morals arise only in humans. And as the next heading points out, morals must have a moral lawgiver. Did moral law require Nazis to disobey the German law to exterminate the Jews? And the answer to that question is no. Moral law would have required them to. I'm getting ahead of myself, because later on we're going to deal with the question, was it against German law? Sorry, I'm missing the word moral there. But moral law, yes, would have required Nazis to disobey the German law to exterminate the Jews. Does moral law require a moral lawgiver? In other words, someone to create it. An authority. That's right. Wouldn't it be dangerous for moral law to come from one person, such as Adolf Hitler? I think it would be quite dangerous, obviously. History tells us. Wouldn't it be dangerous for moral law to come from one nation, such as Nazi Germany? Again, history tells us, yes, That would be quite dangerous. Wouldn't it be dangerous going on here for moral law to come from an international body like the United Nations? What if the United Nations got together and at some point said, you know what, we're making an international law that says if you don't want your unborn child, abort it at any point. And we expect all members of the United Nations to comply with this. You think that'd be dangerous? Or to do as in some countries where they say you can only have this many children or this many of a particular gender, and after that you have to abort. Population control. Or what if they say if someone reaches a certain age and they're sickly and they start dealing with health difficulties, we're going to euthanize them. Well, it's an international body, international law. But you see, there's a higher standard. And I think deep down we all understand that. When Nazi leaders were convicted of violating moral law and sentenced to death, did they, this is the question I was thinking of a while ago, did they violate German law? Well, the note there answers the question. They were following German law. When they were convicted of violating moral law and sentenced to death, did they violate international law? There was no international law at that time, so the answer to that is no. Further, when they were convicted of violating moral law and sentenced to death, did they violate U.S. law? Well, they were German citizens. They weren't subject to the law of the United States. By what law did the Nuremberg trials convict the Nazis? What's the famous phrase? They were convicted for crimes against humanity. Really? Billy said he thought he'd seen something in the news recently where somebody, I guess that would be from Nazi Germany, convicted for crimes against humanity and involvement in what happened under the Nazi regime. And Billy said, if you don't believe in monkey business or monkey trials, then just watch the news. Which is unfortunately true as well. All right, kind of a summary here of the Nazi Nuremberg trials. July 27, 1946, Sir Hartley Shawcross, Chief Prosecutor of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, asserted the basis for human behavior. Said, quote, ultimately the rights of men, made as all men are made in the image of God, are fundamental, end quote. Same trials there in 1946, Chief Justice Robert Jackson said, quote, as an international military tribunal, it rises above the provincial and transient, end quote. And so some summary questions here. If God did not exist, would objective, universally accepted, unchanging moral values exist? No. You have no universal moral values. Do you believe objective moral values exist, universally accepted and unchanging? Now this is where some folks may say, no, I don't. And I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. Therefore, would you agree that God could exist? Hopefully, folks there would say, yes. Does evil exist? I think most of us acknowledge, yes, evil exists. What is an example of evil? I don't know, somebody. What's an example of evil? Child molestation. And yet, the child molester, coming at it from an atheistic standpoint, might say, what's wrong with that? I say, man, that's perverted. That's sick. Your opinion. Not mine. What then? Somebody else said something? Murder. Coming at it from an atheistic standpoint, what's wrong with murder? Well, you shouldn't do that to somebody. That's wrong. Says who? If I want to murder you, and I can, why not? You see, atheism, evolution, macroevolution has no answer for that. And we'll talk about, I'll give you these real quickly. There are 4 questions. I think that's right, 4? Yeah, 4 questions that you have to answer when it comes to morality. What is the origin of morality? And evolution, you cannot explain morals through evolution. Because again, animals don't have any morality. What is the motivation for morality? Can't explain that through evolution. The unbeliever has no answer why, I'm just going to do what pleases me and helps me out. Somebody says, man, that's selfish, Chad. Might say, well, what's wrong with selfishness? The unbeliever has no answer to that. So what's the motivation for morality? Number 3 question that evolution, or at least atheism, dreads like the plague is, how is morality to be defined? How do you define moral versus immoral? You cannot do that without a standard, an authority. And then 4, question that has to be answered, and again, we'll talk about these just a little bit more next week, Lord willing. But number 4 is, does immorality have an ultimate consequence? Look at the lives of Adolf Hitler and the life of Paul the Apostle. Does it really matter if you live like one or the other, if there are no consequences for morality or immorality? It absolutely does matter, but only if there is a God. And you cannot explain morals without God. We'll unpack that a little bit further, Lord willing, next week. Thank y'all very much for the comments and for your time and attention, and we will pick up there, Lord willing, next week.